It's a pleasure to have you all join us here again today at the Virtually Agile Meetup. A few weeks ago, we had holistic testing with Janet and Lisa Crispin. We enjoy having great guests here. We've had Bob Galen not too long ago. We're going to have Michael Lloyd join us with dysfunction mapping. He had a baby, so things got in the way, but we're going to move that session and get that lined up again soon. Congratulations to Michael. Tonight, we are joined by Cheryl from Seattle. She is a good friend of mine. We met at a conference in Lithuania. She is a baseball fan, as you may have noticed a moment ago, wearing it customs a very special baseball shirt. And great singer too. Karaoke, we have karaokeed on a few occasions now. And I'm going to let Cheryl introduce herself because she will do so far better than I and the topic that's going to be in store for you today. But first, very, very quickly, just to ease you in to the topic, question for you. On the screen will appear a question. Why did your latest Agile, Cloud, DevOps, Big Data, Digital, Crypto, AIML transformation fail? That's the GIF is continuing that question. That's someone falling over while they're bowling. Just type your answer. It goes into a word cloud. We'll see what happens. Change and time so far. Trust, something lacking. Sponsorship, people. In fact, if I just change the standard. No time for change. It hasn't yet failed. I like the yet though. That's a very pessimistic view. Lack of trust, no sponsorship, changed out people, mindsets, and a very good answer. Traditional project funding model still in place, unable to move the needle to fund product groups or persistent teams and lacking skill sets. All right, so we're eased in a little bit. We're talking about that today. Cheryl, it's over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. As Chris said, I'm Cheryl and I'm in Seattle. And let me get my screen shared. In the meantime, okay, there we go. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining. How are we doing there? There, I see slides. Do y'all see slides? Looking good?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. So, let me get to my introduction slide, and then we'll talk about sort of why we're here. Here's me. I am Cheryl. I live in Seattle. My pronouns are she, her. And I've been doing this Agile thing for way too long, just a really long time. I've been a consultant at about 5 or 6 different services companies that have slightly different services models, but it all boils down to the same thing because even if you're trying to rapidly deliver a product to a client, oftentimes you're going to get, even as a product consultant, there's obstacles in the way if the client doesn't have the right infrastructure or culture or whatever to take the thing. I have been doing Agile and Lean myself. It transformed a team that I was on and sort of changed my life and the trajectory of my career a good long time ago. And eventually, after we'd kind of settled in and my team was doing a good job, I felt like I had worked myself out of a job, like someone said earlier today, and decided to move on and see if I could help teach what I had learned to other folks. My brand is a little silly and I don't mind doing dumb things or looking ridiculous to try to shake up the culture or get people thinking. I am here with 3 adorable dogs. Let's see, I don't know if you can still see my camera as well, but if you can, one of them is sleeping right back there. They might become less adorable later. It's getting close to their food time. I travel a lot. I was thrilled to be able to go to Lithuania and meet Chris. And as mentioned, I do follow the baseball. I am a proud lifetime fan of the only team to have never gone to a World Series. So we've got a nearly 50-year streak going there. But the World Series here in the States is starting soon, and I will sort of be watching it. I don't hate both of the teams that are in it this year. Anyway, and today I'm wearing my Seattle Steelheads jersey, which commemorates the historic Seattle Negro Leagues team that existed for like a couple of months in the 30s or 40s. Negro Leagues in the United States was league that existed before Jackie Robinson integrated, or rather reintegrated, Major League Baseball here in the States. So very proud of my Steelheads jersey. Had it custom made. So that's me. Let's talk about sort of why we're here. I wanted to let you know that this is overall this topic of kind of dealing with that lack of support from executives and finding the things that we can do as a team is something that I've been feeling really passionate about for the last couple of years. And I've tested a variety of different presentations that tackle that topic in a variety of ways. Today is one of those, and it's super experimental. I absolutely did not write it last night. Would not do that. That would be irresponsible. But the deck is hideous. It's because I know Chris doesn't value slide decks anyway, and neither do I. It's just a way of almost like having my index cards, but in a form that you can share. So it's an ugly deck. I usually like to have beautiful decks, but I don't know yet if this talk is going to be good enough, honestly, to merit a really beautiful slide deck. And I'm going to rely on you all to help me decide that, or maybe help me make it so. So I wanted to walk through what I call the lies of transformation. And I want to say that the genesis of this topic, or where I started to feel like this was something that I wanted to talk to the Agile community about, was taking some of the amazing work that people like Chris have done in the field of retrospectives, but thinking about my experiences with my own teams that I was on, of my own coworkers, teams of my clients that I'd worked with, teams that were adjacent to my clients, so many retrospectives that I've sat through. And I guess tell me in the chat if this is something that's familiar to you, where we come out of our biweekly or weekly retrospective with a list of action items that are, oddly enough, all things that we expect other people outside of the team to do, or things we wish we could have, but they're not us. What we really need is for the infrastructure team to do that, or what we really need is for leadership to change this other thing. And I started noticing it, and then I started pointing it out, and then I started jumping up and down and yelling about it. And I didn't seem to be able to really make a dent in that almost learned helplessness retrospective. And no number of fun retro formats necessarily solves that problem, although I do like changing the formats around to ask different questions can help. It's a small help. But what I found was that a lot of stuff was teams functioning in this learned helplessness space where they were expecting that things weren't going to get any better unless something outside of their control happened. And so I've been thinking, how do we break through those teams that are stuck? And it's not all teams, because obviously the teams that are doing a really good job of like solving their own problems, first of all, they don't hire outside consultants like me if they're really good at solving their own problems. Typically that's not my customer. So one of the things that I've learned as an Agile consultant is that I'm, by definition, boy, especially these days, I'm going into companies that really have deep-rooted reasons for not being able to figure it out, because the ones that were able to figure it out on their own have already done so and didn't hire me. So there is that. So this is sort of an intractable, but as I'm seeing at least a few of you that are finding that you can relate, right? That you can relate to some of this stuff. And I wanted to figure out what are the stories that we're telling ourselves that are making us think that that's the way to solve our problem. Why, when Agile grew up from practitioners and is so explicitly a movement of self-organization, how did we get from that origin story to we are helpless unless our management invests in a new tool or a new framework or a new something? How did we get here? And so I wanted to inspect a little bit of what are some of the lies that we tell ourselves about transformation, and then figure out how might we break through those things that are holding us back and think about our Agile transformation in potentially a more empowering way. So that's where I want to take us today. All right, yeah, exactly. So Sharon's got the right idea, which is only taking actions that are within our team's control. And if there are actions for people outside of our team, then it's a meeting with that team. I think that makes a lot of sense. So that is definitely a healthier approach. And I appreciate about that. I want to call out something that's special about that, which is that you're also taking ownership of reaching out to that other team and having that meeting, right? You're taking that initiative instead of sitting back and complaining about whether that team is or is not doing what you want. So I think you sort of have both sides of the empowerment are in that example in a way that I think is really healthy. That seems like a good thing. Alrighty. So let's talk about it. Okay, so had to throw in the meme. This is my favorite, right? But again, this is kind of the, is leadership the problem? I guess I should also say that I'm coming to this as someone who, through my work as a consultant, I have tried to work my way up into leadership with the thinking that if I could get into a more senior leadership position or into an executive position, maybe I could use the things that I know to make things better at the company. And that leads us to the first tragic lie, which is we imagine that our company's executives have authority to do stuff. Now, how many of you are working at small companies? Let's say 300 or fewer, like less than 1,000, fewer than 1,000 people, small companies. So I see a hand there, some hands, right? So we're going to note that how many are at large companies? A couple thousand, more than 1,000, giant corporations, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I see a few more hands. We're going to start to see that those are quite different experiences when we think about what a leader or an executive can do or not do. In those larger corporations, it might help to think about the division that you work in or the business unit that you're in, something that is a more manageable size. And the difference between that business unit and the rest of the big company is really vast. So as an example of whether or not executives have authority, I worked for one of my clients was a very, 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 very large aerospace manufacturer. There's only 2 of those in the world anymore, and one of them's in the United States, so you can kind of guess, but very, very large. And the person who directly hired my company was the CTO. And you would think that at a company with a C-level title, that the CTO would have authority to make decisions about stuff, and I assure you he did not. That was a company with probably dozens of C-level executives working across lots of different business units, really big, and huge numbers of things that we wanted decided. And as the best example of that, because of the way that large corporation was organized, the CTO didn't own the project management office. PMO was somewhere else under a different C-level executive. And it was only after we'd been hired by the CTO and we were told that we were given carte blanche to transform all of IT at that corporation that we found out the PMO did not report to him, didn't care what he said, and had decided to adopt SAFe. Sad trombones. Nothing we could do about it. So one of the things to first inspect when we're starting to think about what we mean by wanting executive support for a transformation is, does the executive that we're looking at, do they have the authority to do the things that we would want to have done? One of the things that company needed to do was pay its people better. They had rampant turnover so that transformation wasn't going to stick for very long because people would leave because they didn't pay their people enough. CTO did not have the budget to pay them anymore. Wasn't up to him, right? Do they have the authority to do the things that you're looking at them to help do? And as you climb up the ladder in larger organizations in particular, you start to hit senior executives, that could be at the director level, VP level, certainly at the C level, who software is not their realm at all. They've never heard of Agile because they're not in tech. They don't know what this thing is, and in a large measure, they don't care. Especially here in the States, I think it's a really common pattern in large publicly traded organizations to have what I would call like market CEOs rather than CEOs with deep expertise in what that business does. So as a public example, the Boeing company, who I definitely was not just talking about, as a publicly understood example, there was a period in Boeing's history where they used to have CEOs who were aerospace engineers. And then they switched to having CEOs who were devotees of Jack Welch and GM and the kinds of CEOs that are appointed by boards. And so they really didn't care. They didn't only not care about software, they didn't even care about aerospace, right? They cared about how can this company make money. Very different, right? So Taroko has a great point, which is always asking who the decision makers are. And I think that's a great lead into one of the first things that we can start to do as ourselves, if we care about the success of a transformation, is to start really being honest and investigating who has authority over what, and what do those people care about? What do they understand, and what matters to them? Like it makes a big difference. All right, I'm going to move on to another lie, because this one I think is really important. Think about how long a transformation process takes. Think about all the different things you have to do and how you have to work through step by step to really change mindsets and practices and cultures. You have to do these experiments and see how they work and make, inspect and adapt things. And we expect that bigger the company, the longer I would expect it to take, how long that's going to go. And it is, I admit that I do not have a source for this, but it is said that the typical tenure of a C-level executive is 2 years. That was true with 2 to 3 years. So it's also, when you start to think about then what is important to them, you have a lot of caretaker executives or executives that are using their mid-level, mid-C-level as their jumping off point to become a CEO somewhere else, right? They are looking for their next move, and it might not be for your company. If your company is a stepping stone for them on their career, you can also start to think about, I think this is the next question. What are the executives' incentives in that scenario? And I think it helps to actually be, I talk to a lot of folks who are at the team and management level, who, those of us that are mid-level managers and below, are, depending on the health of the job market, we might actually be at our company for a reason. We might care about what our company does. And oftentimes at the very top level of executives, they are folks who are looking for leadership experience leading something, and they may or may not care what that is. And they may have a plan that has them at their next gig in a few years from now. So that certainly if you read something like, a book that was really formative for me was Robert Reich's Super Capitalism, and really understanding how there is a quantum level difference between decisions that senior executives in publicly traded companies have to make versus what we all sort of rationally think is good for the business. They are not the same thing, and it's in ways that can be really difficult to get your head around. So what we're thinking about is, what are the executives' incentives? And another example, and this was at a very small company. I was at a 300-person services company that did great business. We had a lovely sales pipeline. Our consultants were really happy. It was a great place to work. But the founders of that company sold it to one of the giant consulting houses, because their incentive was to take the profit from that sale. And as soon as they finished selling it, they left, took their money and left. And they left our company with what we all called a caretaker CEO. It was CEO nominally because we hadn't finished the merger yet with the giant company. And it took them, because they were a giant company, it took them 3 years to fully finish the acquisition of our company, which was great for us for 3 years because we got to actually work in a company that we enjoyed until they dismantled it. But in the meantime, I reported directly to a CEO who had no power to do anything. That goes back to, what did he have the authority to do? Or he could do stuff, but it wasn't going to stop the fact that we were about to get dismantled by this large company. And the founders had taken their profits and they were long gone. So at small companies, oftentimes small companies, if you talk to the founders, one of the things I ask in job interviews now is, what's the company's exit strategy? And sometimes people are saying, we want to get to X size and go public. Great. That's going to change some things about how the company works. We want to get to X size and we're going to sell. We're going to try to find somebody to buy this, especially if you're doing a new product in the market. Oftentimes, getting bought and letting someone else take over your product is a great way to go. Well, that does some really interesting things when you think about something like decisions about technical debt, right? I just talked last night to somebody who said, they had been fighting to get that 20% time allocated to remediate technical debt, which is kind of your conventional wisdom, right? And we say that, and it doesn't, we keep saying it, but we keep seeming to not really change things. And He said he had been working with that until literally the CEO of his company ordered them to stop. I don't know why. I don't know that CEO. I didn't talk to them. But I thought there are times when racking up a bunch of technical debt and then selling the company to somebody else and making that their problem and taking your profit and leaving is a completely rational way of making decisions as an executive. And we oftentimes at that team and practitioner level where we're focused on doing what we consider to be a good job, we might not think of that. And truth be told, oftentimes we at that team level are going to be left holding the bag for that when they sell the company, because they're going to sell us too. Right? We get to the new company, we've got new owners, and they're like, why can't you ship any technical fixes? Well, 3 years worth of technical debt that the previous owner left you holding the bag for. Right? So those kinds of things, I feel like that's a thing we've seen happen. But you can see where that way of working at the top levels of companies, and again, it especially applies to large public traded companies, but can also apply to small ones. That really changes the calculus when you think about making decisions about doing hard things to do an agile transformation. So what do we do about that? All right. So I don't know about this one. I toyed with taking this slide out. I do think that as coaches we encounter, right, those of us that are coaching or consulting, we often encounter that people are not really making decisions rationally. Or we like to say, like, if common sense was that common, we wouldn't need to call it anything. It would just be how we do stuff. It wouldn't need to have a name. Almost any time somebody uses the word common sense, watch for it. You'll see this. It's not. Right? But we know that people make decisions emotionally. We know that as coaches. We've encountered that, right? On the other hand, I think the examples I just gave you actually don't prove this rule, because I'm talking about executives making decisions that are absolutely rational for their context. One of the things that super capitalism talks about is, if you actually want these slides, absolutely, I can make the slides available. They are terrible, but if you want them, in super capitalism, he talks about how publicly traded companies, at least I know this is true in the United States. I think it's true in Europe, but I'm guessing that it works a little differently because you all are not afraid to regulate a little bit. But here in the States, a publicly traded company has a legal fiduciary responsibility that they must work to maximize shareholder value. They must work to make a profit for the shareholders. They can literally be sued if they don't. And I think I encounter a lot of teams that are really working earnestly on products or services at a company who don't fully understand that pumping and dumping value out of your company is what the company is required to do. And so a lot of that long-term thinking that we try to put in as agilists, as software engineers, as DevOps practitioners, right, as product and designers, a lot of the value that we're trying to add is something that explicitly the shareholders don't care about, and therefore the executive team is also not allowed to care about. They have to maximize short-term profits. That, again, we go back to technical debt. That's going to put technical debt into a whole new lens, right? We gripe about, right? They only think about short-term thinking. Yeah. Yes, they are. Yes, that's correct. So I guess that's a bad example of what I say on this slide, which is that those are actually decisions being made rationally, but they're being made based on context and considerations that we're not thinking about. They're being based on decisions. Decisions are based on information that we don't have. Those are rational, in addition to which people oftentimes don't make them rationally. So, bit of a sidetrack there. Okay, this one, I feel there's a little hubris involved in specifically taking on somebody like Steve Denning, who says this, writes for Forbes. I don't write for Forbes, right? I'm not as smart. I mean, that's a smart dude. But I feel like this wisdom has been batted around for like the last 10 years, and I don't think it's true. And I think it's done us some harm. I worked at an airline for a while, and the IT leaders inside of the airline were really convinced that we weren't really an airline, we were a software company. And because of that, they wanted to invest in what you needed to be competitive as a software company, like really cool office space, right? And hiring ultra rock star programmers. And one of the things that I saw happen while I was at the airline is that the people who had worked there for 30 years, who loved working at an airline, who cared about it, who knew what an airline does, cared about passengers and cared about and knew all the rules, and they knew like the FAA regulations, and they knew why everything was the way it was. Those people were being let go. They were looked down upon, they were thought of as dinosaurs, and they were being let go. And here's the problem with that was the rock star engineers didn't give a crap about us being an airline. They just wanted to work at the coolest place. And what that meant was when they found a cooler place to go work, they went there. When they found that the software problems we had to solve were actually kind of mundane, not super interesting. If to create a new fare class, it's going to take us 8 months because Sabre is a nightmare to work with. When they figured out that airline software problems are not sexy, they tended to leave. And so now we've lost all the 30-year veterans who know how to run an airline, and we don't have any rock star developers anymore. The mess. One of the directors there, who's a friend of mine, was very, very, very earnest about how Sabre, which is this mainframey system that powers everything that every airline in the world does in terms of like reservations and seats and tickets and stuff, Sabre was originally created by American Airlines as their internal system, and eventually they spun it off. And it's now its own company. It does its own thing, but it's super mainframey and hard to work with. And he had a dream that our little airline was going to create the next Sabre, and that was going to require a massive investment from the executives of the airline. What he really wasn't taking into consideration, two things. One is we were barely hanging on as an airline and trying to function as an airline in the United States when all of the airlines are consolidating and everybody's going bankrupt, right? And there's always these travel disruptions, before the pandemic at least, right? That the company was not going to be able to afford to make a big risky investment. That was not going to happen. And so it was trying too hard to be a software company at the expense of being good at being an airline. And so
I'm just going to say, I think there is few things more arousing as a frequent flyer than getting an upgrade to a better class of travel and having all the legroom and that sort of thing. So it got me when you said that. I'd love that. I'd love that. New class sounds awesome. What a great problem to solve.
Well, exactly. And like I used to fly, when I would fly, I would introduce myself as somebody who worked in the IT department, and the flight attendants would be all over me. They're like, can I show you this device that doesn't work properly? It would really help me serve our passengers better if we, and like those were the conversations that got me fired up. Right? I wanted to make that job better because that was going to make us more competitive. There's a really interesting article, just as a side note, about how actually airlines aren't even airlines anymore. They're all banks. Airlines are just banks now. I believe that was in the Atlantic. And that one was eye-opening for me because it was true when I was at the airline that they said our loyalty program and our affiliated credit card are the place where we make a ton of our money. A lot of our airline profit comes in from that. So yeah, check that one out. So not only is the airline not a software company, it's not even an airline. It's just a bank. It's a bank that flies people places.
It's a big floating bank.
Big floating bank.
So when I go on my big floating bank to Azerbaijan next week, that's what I'm going to be thinking about, Cheryl. The fact that I'm flying in a bank.
Yes.
Thank you.
Exactly, Kelly. That's it. I think that's what prompted that article, was the changes that Delta's been making, was they're optimizing being a better bank. Yeah, exactly. And Aaron has the heart of the point. Thank you for encapsulating the point that I was rambling around and trying to make, which is really there, right? Yes, thank you, Joe. Yes, that is correct. Yeah, and also they can just devalue your investment at any time they want because they can change the value of your miles anytime they want. Aaron says, most tech people don't understand the value of the firm creates for their actual customers. Yes, that's exactly the point. So is your company a software company? It might be, right? If you sell software, you might be a software company. Software companies exist. It's just that not every company is a software company. So you got to figure out, as an airline, we weren't selling our software to anybody. Our software enabled the rest of our business, mostly being a good bank, right? Our software was really important to being an airline and being a bank, but we didn't sell the software. So knowing the difference between your software as an enablement versus your software as a revenue generator itself, just knowing that difference helps you understand how your leadership makes some of the decisions that they make. And it can help you be more measured about what they invest in.
Cheryl, I'm going to share an example that I think is really poignant and related to this point. And it's that I think it's gone so far now that companies think everything's software. Yeah, every company's a software company. That just to buy a product in a store, you go to buy a coffee and you have to download an app to buy the coffee.
Yes.
And you're like, but I just want the coffee. I just want to hand over money to you. I want to pay with a card, and I can't do that. So there's almost like this barrier now of tech to get access to something that should be a simple transaction. It deteriorates the customer experience because everything has an app nowadays. I don't want another app on my phone. That's just noise.
I'm a terrible counterexample to that, Chris, because I only ever use the coffee app now. And if I have to go into the coffee shop and talk to a person, I'm annoyed. Like, I'm going to mobile order that drink from my car. I'm going to pick it up in the drive-thru. I'm going to say a maximum of 5 words to a human, and I'm going to get my coffee. So turned the big building that has turned into an app-powered coffee generating machine. But it is worth thinking about what that does to employment, right? The whole reason they're doing so much of that kind of automation is to try to cut down on staff costs, cut down on staffing. They would like us to not talk to a person, a customer, at the counter. I'm going to not do too much ranting about late stage capitalism, but it's in there, right? So.
Well, I will say, as somebody who's hi, I'm Wes. As somebody who's worked with Cheryl before, she can vouch for the fact that I'm pretty quick to speak when I have something to say. So people are always flabbergasted to find out how much time I spend voluntarily sitting alone, not engaging in any social plans, being irritated if somebody calls me without texting to ask if I can take a call first, and absolutely using the app to order my coffee, if that. I might just not even bother because I don't want to walk in and interact with the person to say thank you and pick it up. I just, sometimes the energy's just not there.
Yep. Yes, Jenny, West defies your categorization, but Chris and I embody your categorization. So, yes. All right. How about another wisdom? This is another one I've heard a lot that I think we are seeing right now in the market is not true. And that is the idea that turnover costs more than retaining talent. And I want to point out that that's only true if your company intends to replace somebody that has attritioned with an equivalent talented person, which they oftentimes do not. What they'd like to start doing, and we're seeing this, is they'd love to start replacing those people that turn over with GitHub Copilot, right? With junior level folks, if they don't replace that person at all. So the reason that matters, I think, is that we talk a lot in the Agile transformation biz about, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in the talk as well, about using Agile to make a company a better place to work. And for the previous, let's say, 5 or 10 years of our industry in tech, we were seeing a battle for top talent, right? It was absolutely a job seekers market, and companies fighting with each other to provide the best amenities, the coolest work environments, the most desirable places for people to work so that they could attract that talent. All of those same companies are now laying people off in the thousands and tens of thousands. And not for any apparent reason. Like, we're all looking at what they're doing to liquidate all of those people, and we're thinking it's not really clear why that's happening. A lot of those companies, if you look at the news announcements, it was really like their peers did it, and now we think we're just going to also do it because we can. It's weird, right? And people from inside those companies are saying doesn't make sense what business units they cut or what people they cut. And so turnover only costs more than retention in a job seekers market at best. But if the company is actively looking to downsize, or if they are actively looking to, let's say they've had a lot of folks who have gotten those overall raises, over time, raises and promotions, and have become more senior. One of the worst things that could happen when I've worked in small consulting firms is after 3 or 4 years, we start to have everybody super senior, but we can't sell everybody at super senior rates. We've got clients who want to buy at junior level rates. And so back when those same individuals were junior level, they were super cost effective, and now they're not. And the business model for those services companies where sales is really, really high, right? Where the need for sales is real high and the margins are real low. It's actually in and I was a leader and an executive in companies like that, it became more cost effective to let super senior people take their talent somewhere else and replace them with junior people who cost less. It's actually better for our business. That may or may not be true where you are, right? You may need, but as people become more senior, the work that your company needs done doesn't necessarily become more valuable. So that starts to skew the economics a little bit. And just saying in all cases, turnover, it's better to adopt these either just agile or great people-friendly practices in order to retain talent. That may or may not actually be a thing that your business values or even should value. Scary, right? So this one's a hard one. My team's work is essential to the success of our company. Because I've worked on teams where I wasn't. It's not a reflection of me and my value. Like, I'm great. I'm in there doing a great job. I'm doing the absolute best I can with the thing I was hired to do. I'll give an example. I did a sales call with years ago as a consultant. Went to doing a sales call with a meeting. We traveled and had a great meeting with the executives of a business unit. It was the top leader of a business unit within a very large financial services company. And that business unit was the online payments business unit. So great software, heart and soul of what that business unit needs to do. That's their whole reason for existing. And they were managing, trying to create their in-house version of their online payments system. And they had been doing it for years, and they just realized that they needed to do a big agile transformation because they were starting to see, they weren't really catching up with the competitors out in the marketplace for online payments. This was a few years ago where there were maybe 3 or 4 different players that were kind of vibing for, it was pre-Stripe, but post PayPal. It's kind of in that middle space. And so they were talking about how they were trying to create this online payments offering for their big financial services company to put out in the market as their competitive advantage. And in the course of that sales call, we discovered this is one business unit. Their reason for existing is online payments. Their head is dedicated to making online payments successful. That's what the head of that organization was tasked with doing. However, at the same time that they were tasked with doing that, their parent company became an investor in Zelle, which is an online payments third party. Super rational at the level of the financial services company, they were diversifying. And they'd also figured out that Zelle at that point was far more developed, had a far more presence in the market. And they said, yeah, we'd like to try to see if we can get our company to leave Zelle and come back to us, the thing that we're building in-house. And I said, oh, I was very sad. I was very sad for them, because if I'm thinking about what's happening at the executive level in their financial services company, it's not going to make sense to come back from a consortium with a bunch of partnerships that other banks are already using this product and come and then try to get out of that partnership and do this online payments in-house. That was never going to make sense. It's also a reflection of how that wasn't a software company. That company is a financial services company. They didn't really want to, it really didn't make sense for them to build that product in-house. It made sense for them to outsource that to somebody who's dedicated to software and dedicated to partnerships. Said, Zelle was actually a better deal for that financial services company than you are. And you're awfully late to the party in figuring out that you need to be able to move faster and innovate. I felt like we were hearing them tell us their own story of that ship has sailed, right? They'd missed the opportunity. But we're still talking about hundreds of people whose job it is to be in the online payments division at a big financial services company. And they are measured on the success of how well they do that thing, even though there is very little hope for them in the market in the long term. That's a really tough problem. And nobody's being the bad guy there, I don't think. Just those people are, I could hear in that sales call that those people were trying to save their division and trying to save the jobs of hundreds of people, which we wanted to do. Agile wasn't going to work them out of that problem. But Agile skills might help those people transform. Maybe that business unit can transition to doing some other piece of work with their awesome Agile software skills, and they can find another product to point those skills at. That to me would be the salvation of that group. And so we could talk about, okay, well, maybe we could talk about that. Does that executive even want to have that conversation with me at that point? Probably not. Right? Tough problem. So something to think about is, where does your team or your division's work sit relative to the mission and the success of the company, especially with some of the things we've talked about already today, which is the success of the company is maximizing shareholder value. So can you take an honest look at where that sits? Because understanding that kind of thing is going to help you understand what are the best Agile arguments to actually make that will actually have an impact that leaders might be in a position to listen to, take on board. Where should the company actually invest? Right? What does that make sense? Where does it make sense? What are the different trade-offs that need to be made? And also maybe for yourself, right? Where's your best play for your career and your happiness, or even you and your teammates? Alrighty, it's another one. I feel like we know this one as transformers and coaches. I feel like we know that this one's a lie, right? I worked at a global multinational, 300 developers. So it's not huge, right? 300 developers, thousands of employees, 300 software developers in 4 different countries. And I was brought in by the global head of software development, who reported to the CTO, who reported to the CEO. And I had met all 3 of those people. The global head of software development and I became like bestest friends. We had dinner together a couple times a week anytime I was with them, which was 2 weeks out of every month for 2 years. Right? So I was probably having dinner with him and chatting with him, or lunch, or whatever, like 3 or 4 times a week, every week for 2 years. And he was a former one of us, had risen through the ranks, started as a database developer, right? I was a database developer too. And so like, I know how much people don't think that's even real software sometimes, but he had worked his way up into engineering manager, into engineering director, and now he's the global head. And there were times when he was just so clearly in over his head. And he really earnestly wanted to make things better. And he understood what it was like from when he had been doing the things that we do at the team level. And he cared so much about making change. And it was really interesting how, like, one person cannot just decide. I take that back. One person can ruin a company's culture. Let's do this. One person can make a company's culture worse. I'm not convinced that one person can make a company's culture better by themselves. And so what that told me was, because he really wanted to, and it didn't, there were a lot of reasons it didn't work. And one of them was that he had a history with people where he had kind of screwed things up, not been that great of a leader or whatever. And so when he would try to do the right thing, he'd lost a lot of trust. They didn't always buy it. They also didn't trust that when I went home, he wouldn't revert back to his old ways, which he may have. Exactly. That's the whole point of the saying of the bad apples, right? That's the thing we talk about when, like, the whole point of the one bad apple, like, we've shortened that phrase and we've said it's just one bad apple. The whole point of the phrase is that one bad apple ruins the whole bunch. That's the rest of the sentence. Ruins the whole bunch. So yes, like, I think we may have seen where a toxic leader or executive can damage a company's culture. I think we've seen that. It's much harder for one well-meaning executive to come in and by themselves drag a company's culture up. It's much harder. I don't know that it's impossible, but I think we've got to be realistic about what that takes. Now, part of that comes back to us. Like, that head of software development being very earnest, he needed people to be able to work with him. He wasn't real good at that, right? But they also weren't really willing to work with him. There were a lot of people who were just happy or being mad or being resentful. So how do we, like, I'm not sure that any of us in Agile have actually figured out how to change a company's culture above a certain size of company. Right? It has to be a very small company where we take it over and we just say, we're making this is how we do things now. But if it wasn't founded to have that kind of culture, it's just really hard. I'm not convinced that we've figured out ways to change culture. I'm not convinced it's possible to do that kind of culture change. All right, well, let's get to a couple of the sort of foundational lies. Does your company need to be agile? I don't know. Does it? What do you all think?
I think it definitely works better in some situations than it does in others. I think there's value in Agile that all things could, take a piece of, but maybe it's not the only solution for every place.
Yeah. I don't think I know the answer. I just think we've started to take this for granted in a way that concerns me. I am appreciating the consultant answer. Joe and Mike get it. The answer is always it depends. Thank you for that. Right?
I mean,
But
if you're
that's the whole-
working in a complex workspace, from the like a kind of a model that where probably does need to be agile because you have to, probe, sense, and respond versus like complicated or the other ones.
we're doing Cynefin today, are we?
Well,
Very
a little
good.
bit, just a little bit.
It's all Cynefin. It's Cynefin all the way. Everything's there. No, it's fabulous. I think that is where we can start to unpack this sentence, right? Yes, thank you for another it depends. How complex? Yes, it depends on what we're delivering, how complex delivery is. We got to unpack what do we even mean, right? And maybe that goes back to like the idea of an agile transformation in the first place is what does that mean? Because you and I all know that some percentage of the time that means some executive got found by Dean Leffingwell and got sold safe. That's what that means. Yeah, exactly. Lowercase a, big A. What is it? What does it even mean to be agile? And that's going to inform why do we think we need it? We're going to come back to that. Last big lie. The last big lie. This one just all the way back around. We need executive support. It depends. I don't know. I think we know. See, Mike and I are fighting now. Yeah. I don't think we do. But it depends on what we mean by agile, right? So somebody early on in Chris's poll, one of you all talked about how you weren't in like a product-based org structure. So yeah, I'm going to say if it's org structure and reporting hierarchies and reporting relationships, or maybe even like, I've worked at many companies that were trying to be agile that didn't have user-centered design or human-centered design for their products. We're like, well, that ain't going to work. That's not going to go very well. You can do something that resembles agile without human-centered design, but you won't have successful products from it, right? And they couldn't just go out and hire designers. They had to go through HR and get job codes created and get budget to pay those people. So yes, right, there are some aspects of things you might wish to have as part of your company transformation, agile transformation, whatever transformation. Yes, there are absolutely things that you can or cannot do without proper executive support. But just like in those retros that we talked about at the very beginning, sometimes I think we get over-indexed on the things we can't control. And we got to remember to come back to the things that we can. The dogs are, in fact, hungry. It is, in fact, their breakfast time. So, they were playing really inappropriately a minute ago. I didn't show you that. So, they're good boys. So yes. So let's pivot and talk about what do we do about, because I've been griping about capitalism for an hour now. Let's talk about some things we can do about this. And this, as with almost any good transformation, should start with a lot of asking why. So first question would be not why do we want to transform? I actually want to start earlier than that. Oh, and I meant to put this book on my table and I didn't, but I'm going to grab it. It's one of my favorites. I like this book so much that I have 2 copies right there. So this is one of my favorite books. And it's honestly, there's like 3 pages in it that changed my perspective on stuff. Patrick Lencioni is the author of 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And he's really well known for cutesy business fables that illustrate a point with a little storytelling. They're super easy digestible reads. I have a whole box set of those bad boys. But This is the one, I think is the only one of his that's different from that structure. It's not a fable book. It's more like the aggregation of all the advice he's given in all of these books. So there's stuff about meetings in here. There's stuff about company culture in here. But the thing in here that I liked the best, no, I didn't mark the page, is there's a bit in there that asks the question, and it's targeted at leaders, but I feel like this is good for us. Oh, sorry. It's called The Advantage. It is by Patrick Lencioni. The Advantage. Thank you. Yeah. And I don't get any royalties from recommending that book. If you can find a PDF of it and just read the 3 pages that I like, good enough, right? There's a bit in there that talks about reasons why a company might exist. And it's the advice that he writes is targeted at leaders to think about their culture and how they want to create sort of the vision for their company to make it its most successful. But I think we can do this as a thought exercise, whether our leaders do it or not, and try to inspect what information is available to us to help us answer the question, why does our company exist? Let me take you back to the little place I worked where the founders sold the place, right? So he says, one reason for a company existing is for its owners to make money. And that is a valid reason for companies to exist. And it's best, he says, to leaders, it's best if that's what your goal is, to just be honest about it, right? It could also be for people to make money. So the other book I mentioned was Super Capitalism by Robert Reich. It's a little older now. It's a little bit maybe more dated. Oh, but it's a good one. I should put those on slides. Thank you for reminding me. I'll throw that into the slide deck before I share the deck. I'll give you some Amazon links for those bad boys. Anyway, one reason for a company to exist might be for its founders to make money. And those might be, that might be short-term money. It might be long-term money. Now, some companies are actually founded on a mission, right? They're actually passionate about solving a problem in their business domain. And that's why they exist. And they might be tolerant of less profit because they're solving interesting problems. They want to innovate. Or the founders might be really passionate about innovating. That is also a valid thing, right? And you can think about how that's going to drive decisions very, very differently. If what you're trying to do is maximize profit versus you might be willing to sacrifice profit, just run sustainably and solve this business problem. It's really great to start to look at what signals can you find out about your company or your founders. You won't probably be able to directly ask executives, and they might not tell you the truth anyway, but you can start to observe which one, when given a choice between maximizing profit and more long-term problem solving, which one do they choose? We can figure this out about our own company. Do I work for an airline or a software company or a bank? All I got to do is go to the annual company meeting and watch what they talk about. I can watch our TV commercials and figure out which one we think we are, right? Is my product or service core to the success of my company? All right, there's probably a lot I can do to figure that out. Oh, another reason why companies might exist, and I thought this was charming, and I wish more would do this, was that he talked about how some, especially small businesses, will exist to provide jobs in their community. And they might work on in a more sustainable way just to keep the jobs. And the example of that he gives in the book is if you find that your product doesn't have product market fit, you might actually pivot the product in order to save the jobs. That was a sweet fairy tale. I'm not convinced those people exist anymore, but I'm really, really cynical. So maybe they do. He is way more optimistic than me. But I thought really digging in and figuring out the different reasons why a company might exist. One of them was like the investors want to be cool, right? They want to be associated with this cool thing. So thinking really clear-eyed about one, why does your company exist? And then also, why does your business unit exist? And why does your team exist? To go back to the software company the services company I was at that was bought, we had two sides of this, because one was the founders founded it and sold it, took the profits. But also, interesting question, why did the giant consulting firm buy us? We had a whole bunch of rational stories about how they bought us because we were doing great things that they wanted to learn how to do from us. when the actual reality was it was one executive's passion project. He thought we were really cool. He wanted to buy us. We discovered that that was the reason because that executive, before we even got fully acquired, while I was there, that executive over at the Giant, he envisioned that he could drive a transformation of his whole big company by using us to seed that transition. And he told us a great story about how important we were going to be to driving that effort. And then, and one of my good friends went to work for him as his chief of staff and was going to be in there and was going to be the right-hand person driving that whole change. And then that executive, all of a sudden, with no prior warning, retired to spend more time with his family. Oops. And the person that they brought in to take over his division and all of his investments had never heard of us and did not care and wasn't interested in transforming the way the Giant consulting firm did business. And for all we know, the guy who got retired was somebody who they got tired of him harping at them about how they should change their way of business. We don't know. All we know is that our company eventually got completely dismantled, and any hope that we had a dream of being a reverse merge, and we were going to be 100 people changing the way 10,000 people do business. Wasn't going to happen, right? That was not going to happen. It's a great story. Made us feel good. Didn't happen. And that was us being out of alignment with what the Giant consulting house actually wanted. They were the boot, we were the ant. That's just how that worked. So being, again, clear-eyed. Okay, so now let's go back to Agile, because we're here because we care about Agile. There actually are reasons, there are a bunch of those it depends as reasons why we might want to be Agile at a company. And we might be able to start talking about Agile and the aspects of Agile, the things about Agile that we want to focus on the most, because there's a lot of components to Agile, and not all of, like, chief executives do not give a shit, I'm sorry, Chris, about how good your retrospectives are. They don't care. They care about the outcomes that good retrospectives produce. But the details of how you did them, they don't care. The good news is that means it's up to you. That means if you like Chris's retrospectives, go nuts with them, but use them to deliver the business outcomes that your company's looking for. So the first one that I think we don't lean into hard enough as Agilists that we could is Agile as risk management. In a lot of different ways, this is something that can matter to companies of all sizes. What do I mean by this? We are now going to go to the only slide I made with bullet points on it, and I'm very sorry about it. Very sorry. Here it is. So, what kinds of risk can Agile help us mitigate? One of the big ones is Agile's experimentation mindset and short iterations were designed to help us zero in on things like product market fit and the satisfaction of our customers with our products, right? It was designed to counter the ivory tower boardroom designing the app from the top down and sending us 800 pages of spec of all the features that it had to have, which the market doesn't want because they didn't talk to customers, right? That bottom-up design and designing by iterating and inspecting and adapting our product is a core risk management strategy. It often gets lost in, but when's it going to be done? And fighting about estimates. But remembering that we don't know what the market actually wants until we build it and put it out there and test it is a core value of Agile. And being able to talk about that, not arguing against estimates, but arguing in favor of experimenting because we don't know what our customers actually want until we know, that is something that can frequently resonate if you're in a place where you're doing a product that's any kind of business facing, customer facing. Now, I've also been internal IT where I was doing products that were internal. And that one requires a little bit more clear-eyedness, a little more clear-headedness, because no one cares whether an internal product is delightful. They just want it to be good enough that people will concede to using it. It can be a crap user experience, and people don't have a lot of choice. They want internal products to be done cheaply. So those are different. And if you're not recognizing the difference in why you're doing what you're doing, you may over-index on the wrong thing. You might be talking about, user experience designers doing the internal back office financial product that nobody wants to use anyway, and all the people who have to use it would just as soon keep mucking about in their weird shadow spreadsheets, right? over-indexing on user experience design in that place does not delight leaders and executives, and it doesn't get you the investment that you want. So do you have product market fit, customer happiness, success of your product? Is that a thing that your team needs? Because Agile is really great at that. And being able to talk about in depth about how much Agile helps you solve the business risk inherent in figuring out, trying to mind read your customers and guess what the market wants. That's really important. If you can get good at that, that can get you a lot more investment and a lot more support. All right. New competitor has entered the chat, right? So a lot of times, good enough for your business is good enough. It's good enough. Right up until it isn't. Because somebody else has shown up with not the mountains of technical debt and not the mountains of customer expectation debt, right? Think about if somebody's designing like Smartsheet or Airtable from the ground up, and they don't have all the baggage that Microsoft has from its decades of customers of Office products. Because they can't take a feature out now, ever, because there's one enterprise that uses it. And so that puts them at a huge competitive disadvantage. So are you being agile enough to keep up with your competition in the market? Again, if you're doing back office stuff, this is irrelevant to you. So that's not an argument that would make sense for you to use. But if you are doing something that's market facing, are you paying attention to where your vulnerabilities may be, where a new customer might be able to exploit doing something faster than you can? And in those cases, when you're dealing with a competitive market space, the ability to pivot very quickly, to change, to develop your product very quickly becomes really important, which means you as a team or as a business unit might want to invest in what does it take to be able to respond very quickly, to crank out a new feature. Do you have CI/CD pipelines in there that allow you to get fully vetted, automated, tested stuff to in your customer's hands quickly? If you don't, somebody else probably does. And so that can be a good argument. That leads us to the technical debt argument. But the way I see us making our own technical debt arguments is so ineffective. It's so frustrating. Because we oftentimes will talk about, remember what I said about the average tenure of an executive being 2 years, which means they're going to go ahead and accrue, that's actually to their advantage to accrue technical debt. Get stuff out quickly, break things. Think about, this is a sad example these days, but if we think about the very, very first couple of years of Twitter, when Twitter originally built their product, it was hot garbage, technically, right? They were notorious for the thing called the fail whale, which was the failure screen that you would get when they got overloaded and their infrastructure couldn't handle the traffic. You'd go and try to look at a tweet or make a tweet, and you'd get the, oops, we're sorry. And it was a very cute little whale with some birds around it. And it was legendary. And one of the things that Twitter had to do, I think it was 2 years in or 3 years in when they actually became popular, was that they spent, I think it was a full year or two, rebuilding the entire app completely from scratch at great expense. Because their first app that they built was absolute garbage. And up until last year, that was a good investment, because it enabled them to then become the platform that they became, although arguably they never did hit profitability. So markets are weird, right? But thinking about the original investors in Twitter, imagine how many of them cashed out early and took their profits before that rebuild happened, right? But that racking up of that original technical debt, launching with a garbage site that didn't work very well, was actually a necessary step for them to get market acceptance and to even, they were dead wrong when they first designed Twitter about what people were going to want to use it for. They did not envision what that product became. So also knowing that, right, if they had invested in building what they would have thought was a perfect architecture at that time, it almost certainly would have been a well-designed architecture that accomplished the wrong thing. This again is where Agile can be really helpful, right? Being able to iterate on those things, but also just taking the now completely standard ways of working from DevOps and investing in those things. And that is a thing that teams can usually do a lot more of than they realize, right? Investing in test automation, is, to me, that's just settled law. Like, that's a thing we should do. And I'm always shocked when I find teams that have not done it or that still have a ton of opportunity out there. Automating away your security and compliance needs. Those are the kinds of things. I used to work at consulting firms that sold that because it made sense to bring in some shock troops to go in and hit that really hard and get it up, standing up. But you also needed, teams that understood the value of those things to keep them going, to keep them maintained. You might actually have a talent retention risk. The job market's weird right now, so it's hard to talk about, but you may have a need to keep around people who know where all the bodies are buried, right? Who know how your stuff works, who know how your market works, who know how to be an airline, right? So you may need those kinds of things, and Agile can help with all of those things. So the point that I have in thinking about those past lies is let the lies go and really observe what's actually going on in your organization to understand what is its reason for existing? What do its executives want? What are their incentives? How many of them have incentives that are aligned with your teams and your business units? Because ultimately, your incentive is probably to keep your job and for your job to not completely suck. So let's look at the risk of doing us and them, which I have totally been doing this entire talk, and I'm not sorry. What about the benefits of Agile for yourself? Because maybe your company doesn't need to be Agile. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they're just as happy to go pretend to be safe, which is not Agile, right? But if we go back to Snowbird, Utah, and we think about not just the manifesto, though there is the manifesto, but also the Agile principles, which I am a huge fan of, there's a lot of things in there that are about making our day-to-day work suck a lot less than it often does. For this one, I think about, like, man, we're so frustrated right now with the forced return to office that so many people are going through, that we all know, because we spent the last 3 years proving it, is not necessary. Talk about misaligned incentives, right? Amazon required everybody in Seattle to go back to office 3 days a week. They're pushing for 5 now. And honestly, the reason is, I think the reason is because they would be embarrassed if they weren't using all that office space they built. They can't sell it. Nobody's buying office space now. And you can't easily convert office space into housing. So the fact that they bulldozed the city's entire inventory of affordable housing in order to build their beautiful office spaces that are now standing empty is kind of an embarrassment to them. You got to figure there's like tax implications in addition to that, right? And so we know the forced return to office isn't being done for you. It's not being done to help you do your jobs better. We know that, right? Anyway, but I talked in Lithuania this past week about how we can still use some of the principles of Agile to at least survive, but also maybe to remember that in Agile we have teams that maybe we enjoy working with people that maybe we like, and maybe we have some practices and communication and techniques that help us get along better and achieve a common mission together, and that at least is very satisfying. And so maybe we can start to remember that some of the fun workshop things that we used to do with stickies and Sharpies, like maybe we can do that. Like go back to the things that we at least kind of enjoy doing together. That's not a bad thing. So thinking about what is the benefit of Agile for ourselves, because that to me is a place that we can always start. Right? Using our coaching skills to help our teams communicate better so that we get along better, whether we're physically together or remote, right? Making sure that teams work together as effectively, making sure that we all are aligned on a common mission, maybe helping ourselves understand our outcomes, right? Helping us understand our local small outcomes of stuff we might deliver to our fellow teammates, our teammates, but our teams next to us. Maybe what we deliver up to our business unit, if it matters, doing a really good job, right? Feeling satisfied at the work that we're doing, being able to focus on the tasks that we enjoy doing, right? Creating that space where people can pair and collaborate and flow. And Agile gives us so many cool practices that we can use. We don't need people's permission for it. We don't need fancy tools, right? We need a bare minimum of stuff. And to me, really taking advantage of the principles of Agile that help us make our day-to-day work suck less because we have to go do it. We have to go be there for N hours a week. Now we might have to also commute to do it. So at least we can make it so that we don't hate it. And so we should remember to take advantage of the things about Agile that make our jobs better and make sure that we don't forget those. Maybe not first. No, maybe first. Maybe we do those first. Put our own mask on first, right? And then also help make our business more sustainable because that helps protect our jobs. And then maybe also we are excited about our company's reason for existing and our mission, and we can use Agile to help power that. And sometimes I'll finish out with my final story. One of my first jobs in tech was at the University of Washington in their IT department. And we had the ultimate boss who had failed up. He had literally been put in to manage our little self-contained weird project because everybody in the division that he came from hated him. And they figured out that if they put him over here and gave him a bunch of new hires, they wouldn't have to talk to him anymore. For real. And he had no idea what he was doing. And I had the great misfortune of the economy was really bad then. And I got hired by that guy. But I had a job. It was great. And I tried really hard to get another job somewhere else, and there were no jobs at that time. So we had a guy who was not competent to do the mission. And we also had the problem of project funding that was at risk of being canceled if we didn't deliver a good product. But our leader absolutely did not know how to do that. And everything that I learned about what team self-organization in a really radical sense could possibly mean, I gave the example in Lithuania of the time that we brought screwdrivers into the office and reconfigured our steel case to make a team room instead of cubicles because we wanted one, right? That was a nice thing about working at a university. Hard to get fired for that. But we had a boss who was actively working against the success of our product a lot of the time. And much as we would have loved to get another job somewhere else, there weren't any jobs. And if we didn't do something to be successful at our project, we were going to get our funding canceled and then we'd lose our jobs anyway. So we had to figure something out to work around that guy. And we did in a lot of different ways. We found ways to connect with our customers. We found ways to connect with his leaders, with his leadership. We did a lot of intel gathering to figure out what success for the project was actually going to look like. We took on roles that we couldn't get them to hire for because like we went and learned how to do product management where all of us were just engineers. We didn't know how to do it, but somebody had to figure it out because we had to figure out how not to get fired. And it worked. It was ugly, right? It wasn't the best software product ever designed, but we got something out there and did not lose our jobs. And it was great. And so it's how I know we can do it, even in what are potentially really hostile environments, it works, which tells me that in less hostile environments, it should work even better, right? So to close out, focusing on making our teams a great place and making our collaboration great because we need each other to be able to go do some of the harder things, right? If we pull together and are asking for the same thing with one voice, we may still not get it, but maybe we can figure out better workarounds. And then using all of the intelligence gathering at our disposal, everything that we have access to try to understand what's going on in the company. What are our leaders' incentives? What does this boss need? What is their boss asking of them? What is their boss asking of them? How can we help them with those outcomes? Make them look good. Hey, if I do this for you, can you give me one of these? Horse trading is great, but also just delivering great outcomes in spite of your leaders can be great. Understanding where to invest and where not to invest, or where you're not likely to get support so you don't need to keep beating your head against that wall. All of those are things that can help us make our bottom-up Agile transformation far more successful than if we just waited around for somebody to bring it to us. So with that, I will thank you all for listening to my rant. Thank you, Chris, for having me, and for the back and forth was really great. Thank you, everybody in the chat. And I turn it back over to you.
Boom. Thank you very much. Cheryl, what I'm going to do, folks, if you've not been with us before, I'm going to enable our soundboards. Our soundboard now enables us to give Cheryl some audio love. You can access that using the reactions on the screen. There we go. Love that. Especially given, as Cheryl mentioned, this is kind of a bit of an experimental talk, trying different flavors of delivering it. So there's always takes bravery and courage to do so. Does anyone have any further questions for Cheryl? That does sound very. That sounds very baseball. That feels very you, right?
Yeah, it does. It's that organ. Yeah. It's awesome.
Yeah. Here's when practicing that silence thing.
Trying to think, but like all of the lies, you just like encapsulated all the things around them about like why they exist and everything. I can't think of any questions.
That's it. It's because I've solved it all, right? Like we're done.
done.
We're done here.
Yeah.
I'm good.
Game
We're
over.
good.
You identified
No
it all.
more-
You identified it
No
all.
more transformation failures ever because we know all the answers.
I actually thought of something. So, like, some of the things that you brought up were really, I think, very excellent questions to ask at like a senior management level. But let's say you're going into work with a team or a division or something like that, and you don't necessarily have the access to the people that would answer those kinds of questions. So, how do you tailor, kind of the questions to be more localized to the situation that you're potentially going into?
Yep. So there's a discipline. I'm a Cold War baby, and so one of the things that I read about that was something the U.S. government did during the Cold War when they were trying to understand what was going on in the Soviet Union, but they didn't necessarily have access, right? They couldn't just go ask, and they maybe didn't have the right intelligence assets in place to understand, was this discipline called Kremlinology. And it was the idea that they were trying to glean as much information as they could, or the best guesses that they could from outward signals that were visible to us from across the pond. So they would look at things like a TV broadcast of the Supreme Soviet, and they would look at things like where was each person standing in relation to, let's say, Stalin, to try to figure out who was on the ins and who was on the outs and why. What did they think? What did we know about what they were saying, and what was an ascending ideology and what was maybe an ideology that was on the decline? And I actively used that at one employer where I led a team of coaches, and I actually wrote up a dossier of, you all are going to go to the all-employee meeting where all of the executives are going, and you're going to look at what order do they speak in. And we had the executive who was the head of our business unit that we suspected the rest of the executive team didn't like him, and we thought he might be on his way out. We said, we got to watch, what's he doing, right? When he goes up to speak, what's he doing? Observable data and hypotheses. Thank you. Yes, Joe. Right. And so we wanted to see, how did they interact on the stage with the other executives? And sure enough, when our business unit's executive came time to speak, his boss, who did not do this to anybody else, came out onto the stage and stood looming over him the whole time and watched his presentation. We were like, we don't know what that means, but it's not good for that guy, right? It's not good. So that meant he's in trouble. Now we got to go figure out, why is he in trouble? We didn't totally know, but we could go figure out, well, what decisions does his boss want to have made that maybe he's not making, right? But it told us there's more there. Let's go probe that. What can we find? And so then we would do stuff like looking around on SharePoint, trying to find documents, right? Try to find a vision statement, try to find notes from a meeting. Like, what could we get our hands on that we did have access to? So the Kremlinology was, what can we use that we can observe to make some guesses? And then, I think to Joe's point, like, we would then take that hypothesis. What can we do to test that hypothesis? There's a lot that you can actually do with that. I have the advantage of finding that fun.
Yeah, people watching is great. So I think that's really,
yep.
I don't usually use it in business, but I think I'm going to have to start. So.
Yeah. The other thing that I've done in other talks, I've mentioned this in other talks, is a really, really amazing way to get more accurate information about what your executives want is to try doing something that they don't want. Just make your best guess, do the thing, have it be wrong. And when they say, I hate that, you say, oh, do you? Is there something you'd like it to be instead? Right? And not be afraid. You don't want to be so spectacularly wrong that everybody gets fired, but being just a little tiny bit of wrong that gets you, it's Don Reinertson calls it using failure to purchase information. Right? You put out something that's sort of an imperfect product and get feedback. We know with users, with customers, we know that we have to do that because customers absolutely never tell us the truth about what they want in the product because they don't know either.
Awesome.
Same thing with the executives. Same thing.
Yeah. Love that. Thank you so much.
The one that sticks out to me, it was down to leadership and having very different success criteria. The short lifespan, the fact that they're just trying to get in, get out, and then on the other side, you've got the people on the ground, the people doing the work, the awesome people that I like to hang with, and they obviously have very different needs from a workplace. And what is your, I guess, tips to help each group there, each different party understand each other's different needs and then find balance between them?
I think oftentimes if you have one of those short-termers that's at the head of your company, it's in your own best interest to be able to figure out what do you need to do to be able to pivot. You know that thing that is their pet project is going to be gone in 2 years and someone else is going to come in with a new pet project. So rather than fighting that reality, what can you do to fortify your team so that you are ready when the next dictate comes down and they say, trash that 2-year project you've been working on, we don't even want it. We're going to go do this brand new thing now. How can you just if all you do is that you're emotionally ready and you're able to shrug it off and be prepared to emotionally go into the next set of things, even if it's a technically huge challenge. And yeah, you're going to cry about how much money and time was wasted and how much love you put into the thing that you built for the guy who's not there anymore or gal who's not there anymore. Right? Yeah, facade. Right? So what all can you do to recognize that that's your reality and just honestly, just accepting it is going to give you a lot of power. Accepting it as a neutral, not accepting it and being pissy about it.
Thank you. Any final questions for Cheryl?
I have one. But first of all, I gotta express my admiration for so this is the kind of talk you have in between meetings with people, and you get pieces here and there. Thanks for putting it all together like this. My question is, so you've done basically you've tried so many tactics to turn situations around, involving the team, etc. And leadership's got to notice this. I mean, that what was the reaction of people if they found out what the team was doing behind the scenes? To course correct or understand where they fit into this whole machinery.
Right. There's an it depends in there, because sometimes leadership is honestly, I mean, leaders are made up of I've been an executive. I'm not a particularly good executive, it turns out, but I've been one, and I've also been at the team level, and there are a lot of times those leaders. I'm thinking about my global head of software development who was so earnest about really wanting to do well and just made a lot of mistakes. And so if he found that a team was trying to do something that would help him solve a problem or would help him look better, and they were focused on the same outcome, if you could get him to understand that they were working together on the same outcome, he tended to be a little micromanaging. So he'd be in their stuff and telling them how to do it. But oftentimes with executives like that who are capable of humility, if you can show them that the thing you're doing that's not quite what they told you to do is going to lead to an outcome that's going to be good for them, that's helpful. If you are using your intel gathering skills to understand what does the global head of software development, what keeps him up at night, what is he afraid that his CTO boss might fire him for, and you're going to help him solve that, right? You can fix those things. So I always look at, can you go one level higher and find out what that person wants? Because if you can do for your immediate leader something that makes them look good to their boss, and this is, we don't know how rational or not their boss is. We don't know what their boss's incentives are. We don't know what they've been asked to do. So we got to go find out. So sometimes that works. Other times you're dealing with someone who just can't be dealt with, which I have also dealt with, and we just hid really well. We created private chat channels that the boss didn't know existed in systems that the company didn't have control over. And we would be literally in a meeting talking to him and talking to each other offline in ways that he didn't know about, because we knew that we needed to solve the problem. And that was pure self-preservation. Right? So I've done the whole spectrum of like, if you don't really need that, if your boss is not actually a terrible person, then that's kind of a toxic behavior, but he started it.
I got it. There's so many books by Lencioni. There's the Fable, the fight. I don't remember, but I got like 6 or 7, and I only read one. But he talks about all these. He gives many examples of such situations. And I remember also one case study we did in MBA. It was a travel case company with a very famous scandal with the CEO, where the whole several teams had whole sets of back channels where they were actually trying to run the company until the whole thing exploded. So this is the reality of work. Yeah. So I also appreciate what you said earlier, which is you might not need Agile. You might need bits and pieces here and there, depending on what purpose you want. So did you develop over the years any thinking models, any tools for you to identify where some of these Agile ways of thinking or working have been useful?
I can recommend a couple. One of them is an older one. There's a blog post by Arlo Belshi, who wrote about whether or not you're going to need Agile, and if waterfall works for you, great, use it, no big deal. It's a pretty quick. It's one of those sort of hot takes types of blog posts, so love him. Belshi is Belshee. It's an older one. I don't even know if the blog is still up anymore, honestly. But that one was eye-opening for me. It was looking at that. The other one is, I'm going to shout out to Chris. Do you know how to pronounce Martin's last name, Martin Dalman, who gave the keynote at Lithuania?
I tend to say Martin Dalmin. Martin Dalmin.
So he keynoted at Agile Tour Vilnius last week, and he talked about, and one of you mentioned it, and I can't shout out by name which one of you it was, but one of you asked about complicated versus complex. Oh, it was Fred, and Fred left. So Fred mentioned the complex versus complicated, and Martin gave a great talk about the differences between those two things, where complicated is one where it is difficult. There's a lot of steps, but all the steps are knowable. And expertise really helps in those settings, because if you have experience doing that thing, you can draw upon that experience to do it the same way again. That is one domain where oftentimes the Agile spirit of experimentation is not necessary. You just need to plug through all the things. Complex is where your domain has a lot of unknowns, including the dreaded unknown unknowns. You don't know what you're going to encounter. You have done something like it, but not really like it. Right? Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for coming. And so in the complex domain, we know that we need to navigate it by experimentation, inspection, and adaptation. And we know that we can't just have a linear plan to get to the end. And that's why the when it's going to be done and the estimates don't work in those situations, because so much is constantly changing based on what we learn. That space really, really needs Agile, but not all companies and not all problems are that kind of problem. So using a framework like that to understand whether you even have a problem that demands that level of Agile solution can help save you a lot of headache. Because if all you need to do is get a new FAIR class, and it's just going to take you the 6 months that it's going to take you, and you're going to have a bunch of dependencies, you don't really need to inspect and adapt the process. You probably even implemented new FAIR classes before. You just do it. It's just hard work that you slog away at. And so fighting about whether or not that process needs to be Agile might be a fight that's not worth having.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a good question.
All right, folks, that is it. That's all we've got time for. It has been a pleasure hosting you all once more. Thank you again, Cheryl. Let's give her a final round of love via the audio soundboards. Boom. We look forward to seeing you at the next one in a few weeks' time. Look out for that on Meetup. Thanks again.